We all know the saying, it's not what you know, it's who you know. It's a phrase that's been applied to many sectors, and particularly media, for a lot of years. And it wouldn't work as a phrase if there wasn't some truth to it. There are many jobs and opportunities I've got through someone I knew, someone who trusted me and knew my skills and experience. And I've given a lot of work to people I know too. So, is it such a bad thing? Well, I think the answer isn't simple. If we want more diversity, the who you know networks need to be broken. But if you're looking to hire someone quickly, knowing the best candidates already can help, perhaps. So maybe it's about finding ways to get in, to get that foot in the door and making contacts as soon as you can. I'm David Spencer, and welcome to the Media Mentor podcast. This is all about media careers and sharing advice and guidance on how to progress. I want to help you understand the job hunt more and offer insight on how to make your applications better. Through interviews with professionals from the industry, experts on recruitment, and clients that I've helped over the last 20 years, you'll learn key tips that will help your career. On this episode, we tackle that thorny issue of who you know and getting into media. Colin Kelly founded PR training and consultancy company Comsteria with his wife Emma. Together, they've been helping organisations communicate since 2012. Colin founded the business after an extensive career in journalism. What began as freelance work through his journalism degree grew into staff roles in radio station newsrooms including Scot FM, Real Radio and Radio Clyde. He worked as a gadget and technology presenter with STV and hosted an early morning news programme for BBC Radio Scotland and had a column in the Paisley Daily Express. These days, Colin works with communications and marketing teams and senior management, and I wanted to get his thoughts about recruitment from both the talent side and from the hirer's side. Colin, thank you so much for chatting to me on this episode of the podcast. I think we should have full disclosure that this is our second conversation having had some interchanges on social media, and I know it's the domain of another pretty well-known podcast about disagreeably agreeing, however they phrase it. But what's been really lovely is that sometimes we don't 100% agree about things that I might say or you might say on social, but we can always have a good discussion about it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think having that sort of passion for a particular issue where we, express ourselves maybe quite strongly and share some forthright opinions, but do it in a respectful way. There's not that many people on social media able to do that. So we are, and that's even although we've only actually spoken to each other a couple of times, I think that's quite a nice kind of beginning of a relationship, I suppose.
Yeah, social media doesn't allow a lot of room for sensible discussion. I was thinking before chatting to you, Colin, about how the In-Betweeners comedy program was genius for its creation of people that largely most of us are, which are in-betweeners. We're not really often part of the cool set and whatever other set. We are all in-betweeners. And I was thinking of that in a media context and how really we get a lot of attention, we give a lot of attention to people in media who are high profile. But really, most of us who work in media over our careers are in-betweeners in a sense, just kind of getting by and just existing, doing often a number of things.
Definitely. I mean, I think the sort of portfolio career is a big part of, I guess, the economy and the reality at the moment. I think a lot of the lines are blurred now as well. When I started, there was quite clear lines between journalism and PR and marketing. And I think all that's started to blur. And again, there'd be quite a strict line between like a full-time staff job and then there were people that freelanced. And I think now people go in and out of all of that quite a lot of the time. So, yeah, I haven't quite thought of it as the in-betweeners, but I think that's probably quite a good way of categorising some of us.
Yeah, exactly. I think, obviously, portfolio career is quite a fashionable term, but it makes a bit of sense in that we all probably are quite good at a number of things in media, and we take a bit of time sometimes to establish what any of those things are. But I like your expression about the blurred lines now between some of the different facets. Even if you look at my media job pages, what might be the PR and comms page would feel completely separate maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, whereas people who are doing some journalism may be doing some PR at the same time, and they kind of all certainly intersect. With social media, that's certainly true. But I think that also leads a little bit to confusion for those getting into the industry, because I only ever wanted to do radio. I only ever wanted to talk out loud and try and make people laugh and play music and then be a journalist. For people getting into the industry, for aspiring to do stuff, not knowing if there's a clear path or there's a clear type of job and career is really difficult, I think.
Well, I suppose it is. For me, I wanted to do it so much. And by the time I was 17, I knew it so well that it wasn't daunting. I mean, I think, yes, if you're talking about somebody that does some sort of general degree, you know, and comes out of Glasgow University with their honours degree in English at the age of 21 and somehow decides, I think I'll go and work in the media. That would be daunting, yes. But I think, I mean, certainly for me, I'm sure for you and many of your listeners, this has been a burning passion probably since they were about 12, 13, 14. And really, they should know the industry. I mean, when I was at university in first year, I spent every night, and I mean every night, in the library reading archive issues of the broadcast journal. Right, so I knew by the time I finished first year the history of every aspect of that industry. Now, I only really wanted to do radio journalism, but I knew everything about television production and all the different production companies and how it worked. I knew about international stuff. Like, it was an obsession, and I think a lot of people that it is an obsession. The issue you've got, I suppose, is as the industry's expanded, there are some people now who want to work in it who it does occur to them later. And yes, for them, it will be daunting. And I guess they've just got to catch up quickly.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting because I guess we're in a world where it's content creation. So I'm teaching some students at the moment where that's what it's called. I've taught students about radio and then podcasting, and I've taught them about journalism. Some of those have a clear idea that this is what they want to do. But I think now we've moved into this content world. You know, everyone can produce content. Everyone can, in a way, be a broadcaster within a second. So I think that has changed a little bit what people necessarily think are those clear paths. So as you say, you know, you had that passion, and that's absolutely fantastic. I knew I wanted to do radio. I've already said it on this podcast series that I told my careers teacher at secondary school that, and they just laughed and then asked for a proper answer. But I don't think it's necessarily true that this generation, Gen Z, has less definition. But I think because things are blurred, I think that makes it harder for some, particularly with media, to have that clear vision, perhaps.
Yeah, no, I agree. I also think, you know, you're talking about like content creation. Of course, what you're looking at is people earning money from content creation or having a career from content creation. And I think the way that society's going, perhaps we shouldn't assume. What journalism gave me was, I suppose, a skill set and a structure, and it taught me ethics that then, you know, you can go from journalism to content creation. But if all there is content creation, I think you're putting yourself at the mercy of businesses that know they want content, but they don't. Do they really want to employ people and resource people for any length of time? Or is it just, oh God, we've got this urgent need for content and we need to find some people to create it, and we'll worry about the rest later?
Well, I think it's probably because in some ways it might feel, particularly to traditionalists in a sense, a bit vague what content creation is. I remember being at a journalism event where someone said there are more journalism jobs in 2024 than there were 20 years ago. And I said, but are they journalism jobs or are they just content jobs? And there is a bit of a difference between the two. And I think we know that the government is pulling journalism from its supported courses, and that's really controversial at a time when perhaps we need more people to have those journalism skills that you mentioned. But I also think there is some skepticism because of social media and the changing consumption out there of journalism, of mainstream journalism. And that's also a challenge for what we know as our industry and what has been our career.
It's very challenging, and we're in a real state of flux. You know, people don't trust the mainstream media. It's certainly got its flaws. There's been, you know, the phone hacking scandal. There's been all the issues with the BBC. So there's some very serious issues there. But I think that diminishing journalism is really bad news for society. I think it will come back to bite us, you know, and the so-called alternative media with hardly any checks and balances and no accountability. I think there's some really sort of nefarious players in that space. There's definitely issues around why would anybody ever pay for news? That's still to be resolved. But then we also see some really hardworking and innovative, I suppose, entrepreneurs, you know, developing these Substack newsletters. So things like the Edinburgh Minute and the London Minute and the Glasgow Bell, these email newsletters where it's still independent journalism, but it's not necessarily alternative, and it's, you know, it's not full of misinformation. It's got the same checks and balances that maybe you and I would recognise.
Yeah, and I think that brings us quite nicely in a way to not necessarily arrogance in recruitment, but I wonder sort of there's almost a naivety in what I think is recruitment in media broadly. Now, obviously, I talk about jobs in radio, TV, journalism and PR and comms pretty much, and then obviously entry-level roles in sort of content creation. My view, Colin, is, as lots of people know, listening to the podcast or reading what I put on social media, that generally I think recruitment is really inefficient and some of the best people are just not getting to the right jobs. And I wonder if that's, you know, media. And then I have conversations with people in completely different sectors and they say, no, recruitment is just a problem for us too. And I wonder why that is, and, you know, whether I'm being harsh or whether there is a sort of broader issue.
I don't think you're being harsh at all. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's very inefficient. I think it damages both the organisation and the department doing the recruiting, and it damages the people going after the jobs. And I do think that it probably disheartens some people. I hope it doesn't, and I really hope it wouldn't put them off, because you really need to be persistent, and please don't blame yourself. I spend most of my working life now working with, you know, comms teams and PR departments and the people probably doing the recruiting, and without slagging off all my clients, I think it's fair to say there's some really serious issues where they don't know what they want a lot of the time, and they don't work that well with other departments. So if I'm trying to recruit in a newsroom or in a comms team for a charity, I have to work with HR, and then eventually we'll get a job ad out. That process takes months, and sometimes, you know, what they're going out and asking for doesn't really tie up with what the original head of that department was looking for. So I don't know that it's done deliberately or that it's particularly anybody's fault. I think it is poor communication, at every turn, and a symptom, I suppose, of this very fast-moving world that we're in. And I also think sometimes that the right people or the best candidates maybe aren't positioning themselves properly.
I think one of the things is about people not necessarily knowing what they want, the speed of recruitment, and those sort of internal processes in whatever organization. I think that there are issues with that, and it's not necessarily the individuals within the machine's fault, it's probably the machine. But definitely communication is something in media we don't do well. But also, I think what you touch on there is what I think a lot of people are very cynically believing, and I think they're right to believe it, that who you know still matters in media far too much.
Yeah, yes. I don't know if it's I've got to say, I don't know if it's a bad thing. I was reflecting coming into this that I worked full-time staff jobs in the media for 17 years and never applied for a job. Because I think it gives them, the organisation, know exactly what they're getting. They find opportunities for that right person, and it means I knew the organisation inside out, and I knew where I could add value. And that started with me, literally with my foot in the door at 15 years old, and ended up with me, sort of deputy news editor and anchoring programmes and all that. Never applied for a job. I did the recruiting. I was on the interview panels and so on. So I saw it happen, and there are certainly, I would say, bits of the process that is fair and is traditional, but there's a hell of a lot of it that isn't. And I've got to say, I think that's okay. And so my advice to your people, David, is put yourself in a position where you will win an unfair fight. I think that's what you need to do. You need to win an unfair fight. And if you imagine maybe you get invited for an interview and there's going to be a panel, so there's maybe a head of news or a head of comms and a couple of their colleagues. And when they're walking towards the room and saying, who are we interviewing next? Oh, it's David. And one of the panel will turn to the head of news and say, David Spencer, who's he? And the head of news will say, he's the guy that does that podcast, or he's the guy that wrote that thing. And as the candidate, you need to know what that line is. You need to know what you would want that line to be. Because if there's nothing, then you're really up against it.
And I think coming back to what you're saying about put yourself in the position is the messaging that I try and give through the podcast and through the mentoring sessions, which is, if you're not in the mix, then you haven't got a chance at all. So what does that mean? Well, that means doing the things that you described in a sense of when you wanted to get into the industry. You're sort of going to contact people. You're going to make people aware of what you produce. And going back to where we are now in 2025 with this massive content, it's really easy to produce things to show what you can do. So at the very least, you need to be making stuff and producing content and have evidence that you can do stuff. And then the idea that you've got to, as you put it, sort of, win this unfair battle. You've got to be putting yourself in the positions to give yourself a better chance of standing out and being visible.
Exactly. It's all these extra things that you do, journalism, content creation. It's a vocation. There's no barrier to entry. Get on and do it. My son's just turned 13. And he's got a little podcast studio in his bedroom, and he's doing a podcast during the Club World Cup. Now, a year ago, he had no interest in world football. Now he's learning about all these different football teams to give himself an edge. He doesn't publish his podcast. He just sends it to me. It sits on a little Google Drive that the family use. But it means that if somebody says to him, in a few years, what have you done? He can tell these stories, he can show that evidence. So it doesn't need to be amazing, it doesn't need to be polished or even published at all. It's about you going through that process and trying to find these things that will separate you from everybody else.
I love that story so much because I think probably you and I have both been there, whether it was me with weather maps in my bedroom and blue tack and doing weather forecasts, or doing music shows to myself and my parents worrying about me chuntering to myself in my bedroom. But these things are beautiful in the sense that, you know, now you can do so much. And if that podcast about the Club World Cup did need to go out to the world and give some, you know, probably quite interesting different perspective, you could do it. And I think you're so right about, I said a lot, don't say you're passionate, show that you're passionate. So that's a real example of that. I think just finally, in terms of a question about recruitment and getting into the industry, one of the areas that we have agreed, sort of disagreeably agreed on, is that I think paths into the industry are, you know, I think it's really hard. Maybe you have to do a degree, whereas I haven't got a degree. I didn't go to university, and people think you have to do that now. There aren't as many apprenticeships as there were. So I think diversified paths, and therefore getting diverse people into the industry, I think it's harder. But I'm not necessarily sure that you fully agree, partly maybe for what we've just said.
Clearly, you don't need a university or a college degree, right? So I don't think there's any argument about that. I think what it gave me was, first of all, it gave me time to find my feet, to do some freelance work, to get to know people. The other thing it gave me was contacts, right? You know, so being a student for 3 or 4 years allow you, for a start, you know the lecturers on your course. Some of them probably have contacts or are even working in the industry themselves. Then you've got all the other students, you've got students in other years. You know, that whole side of it, I think, is very useful. And I think that is the path in, rather than the bit of paper with the degree on it. Clearly, there's things like Bauer and Global, maybe others, have their academies and are you know, making some efforts to try and recruit. And there is a problem with diversity. We know that the media industry is overwhelmingly white. You've got too many males in powerful positions, and you know, the kind of private school clique is still there. But I've got to say, like, I went to comprehensive school, and every boss I had was a woman. So I don't know. I personally, I just think that this whole industry is every person for themselves, and any help you get, whether that's college or university or just starting grafting, which is great as well, or speaking to somebody like yourself, you know, you take any route you can get.
Colin, it's been fascinating talking to you, really interesting, because again, we've agreed far too much. We probably, as you mentioned at the end there, we ticked a couple of the dominant media things, which is probably middle-aged white men talking about things and talking about diversity, which often can seem a bit ironic. Colin, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast, and also just being a great supporter of what I try and do on social media and just more broadly. And it's been fantastic talking to you.
My pleasure, David. It's great to see what you're doing, and yeah, long may it continue, and I wish you every success. Thanks very much for having me on.
A lot to think about after my chat with Colin, and I think it really underlines just how important it is for aspiring journalists and media professionals to get stuck into content creation in some form, whatever that means. Not just on your own, but then building networks with people, making those contacts. We might not like the idea of who you know being so critical, but as Colin said, maybe it's just an unfair fight at the moment, and you have to do what you have to do to try and win that fight. That's it for this latest episode. If you'd like to find out more about my mentoring and support sessions, then get in touch via themediamentor.info. One-to-one sessions are held online and totally confidential. For the latest media jobs, you can visit my website. Plus, we have the WhatsApp channel where all the jobs I find get shared as they drop. Details in the pod description. Thanks again to Colin for a fascinating interview, and thanks too to Mrs. Mentor for managing the job website and genius sound designer Josh Sommer for writing this music. And thank you for listening. Remember to click follow on your favourite podcast player to keep up to date with the latest episodes, and please write a review if you've enjoyed listening.